Thank you for inviting me to speak at this workshop, and apologies that I can't be there in person. My name's Chris Howe and I'm Executive Director of WWF New Zealand. WWF is a global conservation organisation founded in 1961 with 6 million supporters worldwide. Big for an NGO, but small in absolute terms. Our reach is far greater, however. Perhaps 1 billion people get involved with WWF every year, and in New Zealand we have 50,000 supporters with a reach of people who share our values of at least 400,000. Today I'm going to talk about why WWF partners with businesses and how we go about it. I'll talk briefly about WWF globally, then about our drivers for partnering with business, and then more specifically about what happens in the early stages of developing a partnership. But first, I'm going to talk briefly about what we're not. Later in this talk, we'll see some of the mechanisms and approaches WWF has founded or helped to found which do endorse companies and products, because we know that many businesses want and need assurance that they have achieved a level of sustainability. But it's important to understand in the context of social license to operate that WWF itself does not do that. However, let me start with some fundamentals. WWF's mission. It is what sets us apart. People are at the heart of what we do. It also provides the absolute starting point for any business partnership, and I'll spend a minute or so explaining why. WWF's business is conserving biodiversity and reducing ecological footprint. Every 2 years we publish the Living Planet report. This report looks at how our biodiversity is declining and our footprint increasing. So here are the critical concepts behind WWF's approach to partnering with business and social license to operate. It's about conserving biodiversity, it's about reducing consumption, and it's about increasing sustainable production. So there we have it, the loss of species and habitats. We're consuming too much, and what we do produce, we're not producing sustainably enough. So these 3 things, biodiversity, footprint of consumption, footprint of production, what does that mean for WWF and our business partnerships? Well, these are our goals. For biodiversity, we focus on places and species. Here are just a few. And for footprint, we focus on soft commodities, climate and energy, and water. So that's quite a lot of context, and of course there's quite a lot of detail behind it for WWF, but it's important to have had a quick look at that, as it underpins why WWF partners with business. In fact, it underpins all of our work. When WWF initiates any program of work, including with business, it must align with our strategic objectives. In fact, we have some flexibility locally, but in general, 80% or more of the work that we do aligns with our global priorities, the biodiversity, species, places, and footprint priorities I've just set out earlier in this talk. Now, why have I spent so much time on this? It's because one of WWF's points of difference globally is that we prioritize engagement with business as a way of trying to meet some of those biodiversity and footprint goals. You can see that if a business wants to partner with WWF as part of its social license to operate, then a deep understanding of where the intersection is, where the joint interests are around that footprint reduction and biodiversity conservation priorities is essential as a basis for deciding whether to partner or not to partner when we're having those kind of discussions. So WWF has worked with businesses since our founding in 1961, and it would be fair to say that in the first 10 years, 20 years, it was very much a funding type relationship that we have with businesses. This is the 60s and the 70s. Businesses would sponsor projects, particularly in developing countries, mostly biodiversity conservation projects, and that's the nature of the relationship. In the last 30 or 40 years, though, we have evolved that significantly, and I think particularly if you look back at the Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit a couple of years ago, a few of the developments in the decade before that, it's very clear that business in particular has a critical role to play in conserving biodiversity and reducing footprint. And so it's a very clear, very strategic direction from WWF, which is about if we don't engage with business, and if business doesn't change the way that it does business, then we won't save biodiversity or reduce footprint. Now, it's not the only thing that we do. We also still engage directly with governments, and we still engage directly with communities. So we work across all three sectors, but we place a big importance on business because of the impact that business can have, and that's why you see these major relationships coming through with WWF in the last decade or so. WWF's business partnerships usually have at least 2 of 3 components. If you are a business that wants to partner with WWF, then this is what you're up for. You'll need to embark on a 3 to 5 year program of transformation, where that transformation makes a substantial contribution to reducing footprint and conserving biodiversity. You'll need to invest in joint communications to your staff, customers, and suppliers with at least an intention to change behaviour and preferably a measurable impact. And you'll need to invest directly in specific projects. So I think it would be true to say that there are businesses that assume that a partnership with WWF involves a cash sponsorship in return for use of the logo. And I hope with the first part of this presentation, I've given you some context and depth on what WWF's business partnerships are like in reality. I should just say at this point that through the communication and philanthropy pillars of our relationships that you've just seen on the slide, use of the logo can happen, and here are some examples. But as you've seen, these should always be in the context of our strategic priorities of conserving biodiversity and reducing footprint. Now I'd like to give you a brief glimpse of 2 of WWF's long-standing business partnerships, Coca-Cola and HSBC. Now information on these partnerships can be found easily on our website, www.panda.org, or just by searching Google for WWF Coca-Cola or WWF HSBC. Both of these partnerships are more than a decade old and involve all 3 pillars that I described earlier. Coca-Cola, for example, have made a range of commitments across water, climate and packaging, as well as investing millions into projects on the ground through the Coca-Cola Foundation. I'll just pause here to note that WWF regards company foundations as the company themselves, especially when it comes to risk and reputation issues. HSBC has made substantial commitments to making their lending policies better for the environment and has invested tens of millions of dollars in field projects worldwide, including $800,000 towards the Reconnecting Northland project in New Zealand, a partnership between WWF and the New Zealand Landcare Trust with the Tyndall Foundation, ASB Community Trust and HSBC Global Water Programme as the funding partners. So I'd really encourage you to follow through and look at both those relationships. From a business perspective, both companies have found great business benefits from the partnerships, otherwise they wouldn't have renewed for a 3rd and 4th time respectively. So HSBC and Coca-Cola benefit in numerous ways from the partnership with WWF. They have access into communities, strong community relationships that WWF has, and isn't that a very important part of social license to operate? They benefit from our skills and experience of over 50 years working in this area, and they benefit from standing alongside us and announcing the transformational goals that we've agreed together. WWF is pragmatic. We understand there must be a business benefit, and in fact we believe, as should be obvious through this presentation by now, that better business is in fact better for the planet. Now I'd like to describe briefly what happens in the early stages of a partnership development with WWF in a business. Most importantly, at the beginning, we have a stage which we call the scoping or due diligence phase, and it goes back to a lot of what I talked about early on in the talk, those priorities of species, places, issues, themes, and so on. The things that we generally call WWF's priorities. The report will look at the intersection between WWF's interests and the company's interests. Does it have an impact on priority places? Does it have an impact on priority species? Is water a big issue for the company? Is climate change a big issue for the company? Are they a significant investor, a financial investor in some of those priorities? Does the company have a major interest in our 15 soft commodities, for example? Is it a major player in the supply chain? And then on to issues such as, does it have a deep reach into populations, communities, audiences that are of interest to WWF? Does it have opportunities to communicate with suppliers employees and customers? And are there significant risk and reputation issues for either WWF or the company? All of these things will be covered in the scoping due diligence report. Once a scoping report, which is almost always confidential, is complete, it sets the agenda for what a partnership should look like or might look like, and detailed discussions can take place. Those discussions are about those three pillars we looked at just now: transformation, communication, and philanthropy. And if all goes well, we end up with an HSBC or a Coca-Cola type partnership. So I hope you find this an interesting insight into how WWF partners with business. There's no doubt business finds multiple benefits of partnering with WWF because of the approach I've described in this talk. Others do it differently and perhaps more simply, and there's certainly a place for that. But WWF believes that deep engagement both into business and into community works best for people and planet, and certainly provides an important part of a business's social license to operate. Thanks again, and I hope to be able to engage with you on this issue in person on another occasion.